In a city that tiptoed, adorned with silence instead of jewelry, an era was born that regulated its breathing as precisely and quietly as a clock. The dresses were wide, but life was narrow, the words were few, but what remained unsaid was paramount. Welcome to the Victorian era, where dignity lay in the bow and the heart was concealed behind a silk glove. At 6 o'clock on a cold morning in the winter of 1850, London began to stir, not with the sound of birds, but with the sounds of iron wheels dragging on cobbled streets and hurried feet sinking into the fog. The sun had not yet appeared, but the city opened like a heavy theater curtain, slowly and with a silent yet pervasive hum. The milkman called out loudly in the narrow alleys, pulling a small wooden cart by hand. He stopped at every door, pouring milk into glass bottles and knocking gently. On an upper floor, a lady opened her window slightly, breathed the air that felt like cold water, and then returned behind the curtain to wake her 3 daughters. The hour for needlework would not wait. In another street, a cart for cleaning the city emerged, pushed by hand and loaded with ash, coal, and the heavy residue of the night before. London did not sleep clean, it washed itself with the start of every morning. Workers in thick coats and tall boots dragged the dirt, swallowing the dust without complaint. No one heard them, and no one thanked them, but they were part of the city's rhythm, like the hands of a clock. By the bridge, a man in dark clothing attended to a gas lamp just before it went out completely. The lamps lit the night and dimmed with the day. He extinguished it with a long pole, then continued to another neighborhood, his name unknown, yet performing this solemn, daily ritual as if commissioned by the city itself. A small bell rang at the bakery door. The bakers had started hours ago, and the hot loaves had just come out of the brick oven. The air in this street was different, carrying the smell of burnt wheat and butter. Nearby, a few small, shivering children passed, stopping in front of the glass display, contemplating the loaves as if they were forgotten treasures. Another closed cart passed, shrouded in cloth, carrying something unseen by passers-by, perhaps vegetables, perhaps laundry, and perhaps the secrets of a household that would not open its doors until noon. In Victorian London, no one asked too many questions, and no one confessed. In the wealthy district, windows were opened from the inside, and curtains moved gently. Maids began covering the white tables, polishing the candelabras, and placing the reserved newspapers for each gentleman of the family. Everything was calculated precisely, even the placement of the small spoon. In contrast, in the homes of the poor, wet blankets were pulled off bodies, water was heated over a barely lit fire, and dry bread was divided among the family before the father left for the factory. The streets were still soft with fog, as if the city were trying to hide its face a little before the sun rose. Doors opened one after another, carts increased, and sounds rose, not as shouting, but like an orchestra beginning gradually, note by note. Thus, without anyone realizing it, London awoke. Yet, beneath this seemingly cohesive surface, there was another world unseen from the windows or reported in the newspapers, a world living in the basement, where light did not reach and talking was prohibited. And there begins our next story. In the basement of Victorian London homes, the sun did not rise. Light did not reach there, neither through windows nor through conversation. It was a world unto itself, inhabited by soft footsteps, short whispers, and orders executed without discussion. A servant's life began before dawn when the city was still asleep, when no one could hear the sound of cold water poured into a metal basin as they quickly washed their face. They put on their dark uniform and combed their hair hastily. No time for yawning, no time for thinking. Tasks were divided as breaths were taken, every male servant knew his place, and every maid knew her silence. The cook started preparing breakfast before the family opened their eyes, another maid cleaned the stove, rearranged the spoons in their designated drawer, and filled the water jug. The stable boy swept the straw and prepared the horse for the master's carriage. No one asked anyone their name, for titles sufficed, the cook, the parlor maid, the boy, as if they were not human, but tools. In the long corridor underground, a line of shoes gleamed every morning. Shoes said a lot in the homes of the elite, so there was no room for error. Every shoe had to shine as if new, even if it hadn't been worn for days. Clothes were ironed with steam and hung on hangers according to the order of the rooms. The rooms below were small, their walls cold stone, and their beds narrow, barely enough for interrupted sleep. There were no fireplaces and no windows overlooking anything. The servants' dining room was devoid of conversation. They sat hastily around a simple wooden table. They ate the leftovers from the upstairs table and then returned to work as if nothing had happened. The rules were strict. The maid was not allowed to speak to anyone in the family unless asked, nor was she allowed to go upstairs without permission. If footprints were found on the white carpet, the penalty could be dismissal and loss of wages. Every movement had to be calculated, and every breath had to be quiet. Relationships between the servants themselves were also governed by silence. Proximity was discouraged, and there was no time for friendships, as everyone was exhausted and everyone feared making a mistake. Some hid letters from home in a small wooden drawer, reading them secretly under candlelight, then returning them to their place as if they had never been. Yet, amidst this iron system, sometimes shy human moments appeared, such as when the parlor maid placed a small flower on the breakfast table without being asked, when the cook slipped an extra piece of bread to the boy without the mistress seeing, and when eyes met, even for a moment, before returning to the floor. The servants were the invisible backbone of Victorian homes. They kept everything clean, polished, and quiet, but they lived in the shadows, unseen and unwritten about. They were always there, behind closed doors. But if morals were imposed from above, how were these rules shaped, and who was watching whom? In Victorian England, morality was not just a choice, it was a precise system, like the clocks hung on the walls of parlors, steady, quiet, and intolerant of error. From the first years of childhood, a boy was trained on how to sit, how to hold a napkin, and how to greet his elders. A girl was taught how to lower her eyes when speaking, how to hide her emotions beneath her attire, and how to keep her voice like a whisper. Society did not forgive those who erred. A loud laugh or waving your hand while speaking was enough to be branded ill-mannered. Every movement had weight, and every word had a timing. Silence was sometimes better than answering. Morality in that era was not always internal, it was monitored externally. Neighbors noticed, relatives whispered, servants reported, and at parties, eyes were stricter than laws. Those who did not behave as expected lost invitations, respect, and perhaps marriage. A famous example was a lady's walk in the street. If she walked too fast, she was said to be masculine. If she walked too slowly, she was said to be seeking attention. Thus, she had to walk as if she were not walking, to pass like a subtle, respectable ghost. Even exchanging glances was governed by custom. A long look might be interpreted as an invitation, and a fleeting glance might be considered rude. As for smiling, it was a dangerous weapon in that era. It was not easy to smile without being misunderstood. Books were distributed among the upper class teaching people how to speak, how to sit, and even how to display grief at funerals. Yes, even sorrow had a specific, controlled way. No screaming, no public tears, everything had to be calculated, polite, and clean. Clothing itself was part of this system. It was unacceptable for a woman to show her ankle, and it was improper for a man to remove his hat at the wrong moment. There were classes, but morality was not exclusive to the rich. Even in poor neighborhoods, people imitated what they saw in the aristocracy, trying to appear well-mannered even when hungry, for respect, as it was said then, was bought with behavior, not money. But behind this solid shell, there were those who suffocated, those who could not be themselves, who hid their sorrow, their laughter, or even their love. Because the rules were numerous, breaking them was tempting, and the price was high. How did children live amidst this social silence, and were they allowed to be children? Childhood was not as we know it today. It was not full of laughter, play, and bedtime stories, but rather a waiting station for adulthood, poverty, or work. A child had no time to be a child. They had to learn silence, sitting straight, and avoiding disturbance, because crying was a sign of weakness, and too much playing was considered poor upbringing. Children were raised behind closed doors, in rooms far from guests, under the supervision of strict nannies who did not allow spontaneous hugs or excessive joy. The child there learned to read before learning to run, and was trained to perfect silence before being allowed to speak. The nanny was the second mother, or perhaps the only mother they saw all day. The child was forbidden to interrupt adult conversations or speak before being asked. Eating had rules, walking had rules, and even laughter had limits. It was not acceptable for clothes to get dirty or for a voice to be heard in the corridors. They were always told, "Behave as if you are not there." In poor neighborhoods, there was no time to teach manners. The child there was not afforded the luxury of learning or playing, but began working as soon as they could carry coal or push a small cart. By the age of 7 or 8, many were already in mines or factories, dealing with huge, noisy machines in places where the sun never entered and the noise never stopped. In the mines, small children crawled inside very narrow tunnels, carrying coal in sacks on their small backs. They returned to their homes covered in black soot, not speaking much because fatigue stole even the ability to talk. In the factories, their small fingers were used to fix pieces that adults could not reach, and often one was lost in a sudden accident without the industrial line stopping. There were no laws to protect them. The law favored the factories, and society justified it all with the phrase, "Work teaches discipline." The poor child was punished if late or if they slept in a cold corner during a break. They were kicked to wake up. No crying here, only the eyes spoke when they gleamed for a moment and then went out. Despite the harshness, children invented their own moments. They might play with stones on the way back from work, steal a moment of laughter inside an empty cardboard box, or listen to a story from another child about a city they had never seen. They made hope from the scraps of the day and kept it under the pillow, if they had one. In that era, childhood was measured by patience, not years, and every child had a small old person inside, waiting to grow up or to forget. But in another place, tea was poured softly, appearances were arranged carefully, and social rituals were practiced as if they were an endless, non-stop performance. Tea was not just a drink, it was a small stage where displays of sophistication, discipline, and class were performed. The small teacup carried on its surface what books could not say, who you were and where you stood in this society. The tea ritual usually began at 4 in the afternoon, when the sun began to tilt and golden light crept into the velvet parlors of the high society homes. Lace tablecloths were spread over the heavy wooden tables, and trays of fine Chinese porcelain decorated with delicate flowers were brought out. The tea itself was not poured haphazardly, but from an elaborate pot and by a hand wearing a white glove. Ladies sat in facing rows with straight backs, eyes watching who was late and who laughed too much. Conversation revolved around the weather, news of marriages, and perhaps the latest hat designs. No room for political discussion or complaint, everything was light, calculated, as if the air itself received instructions before moving. As for the cake, it was also part of the language. It was not eaten before being offered to the most important guest, and it was not held directly by hand, but broken with a fork. Butter was spread with a special knife, and jam was placed in an amount that did not attract attention. Every detail said something, even if no word was spoken. In middle-class neighborhoods, families tried to imitate these rituals, even with simple means: a small table near the window, a tin pot, and cracked porcelain cups. The mother was keen to have the tea ready, even if there was no sugar in the house, for appearance was more important than taste. In the alleys of the workers, where there was no clock on the wall, tea was prepared after work, not at 4, but it remained a moment of rest where the fireplace was lit, the noise was silenced, and everyone gathered around one cup shared by the children. There was no parlor or luxurious tray, but there was a warm silence that resembled respect, even in exhaustion. Newspapers wrote about the elegance of serving tea, described the appropriate types of sweets for each season, and advertised imported teapots from India or China. Governesses taught girls how to lift their little fingers when holding the cup and how to appear modest from the very first sip. Tea was not a goal, but a means to show sophistication, to differentiate, and to affirm belonging to a class that knew how to regulate time and fill moments with beautiful silence. It was said then, if you want to know a woman, observe how she prepares tea. And with all this sophistication, it was women who bore the greater burden, from setting the table to embodying grace, and from arranging flowers to hiding exhaustion behind a gentle smile. But behind those gleaming fabrics and delicate cups, there were women who felt they were in a silk cage, required to smile and be a model of elegance, even as their spirits were breaking inside. What did it mean to be a lady in the Victorian era? What was expected of her? And what was life like behind closed doors when no one saw her? Womanhood was not a gift, but a duty, and a lady's home was not a place of rest, but a daily stage for a silent performance that no one applauded. A woman in that era was raised to be a soft shadow whose voice did not rise, whose presence did not disturb, and who did not break the rules, even if she suffocated inside. She began her day in front of the mirror, not to contemplate her face, but to make sure her features did not show anything improper. Her hair was styled back, the comb leaving no loose strands, and her skin had to be as pale as possible, for noble femininity did not know a tan. Then the rituals began. The corset was pulled tight so that her waist appeared only as a thread, the dress was lifted off the ground but did not reveal the ankle, and gloves were worn even in the heat. She was not allowed to walk quickly, sit as she pleased, or laugh loudly. She had to speak gently, walk gracefully, and be ashamed of everything, even herself. And if she spoke, her words had to be measured, not too long, and not carrying a sharp opinion. In the parlors, ladies sat in small circles, talking about flowers and rain or the last dinner party one of them attended. Talking about science or politics was not their concern, even if they read books secretly under the bed covers. Knowledge was a dangerous luxury that might distort the image drawn for them. As for the unmarried girl, she was required to be like a mirror, clear, still, and ready to reflect the desires of the man who would propose to her. She had to master playing music, embroidery, and reading poetry, not because these skills mattered to her, but because they pleased society. And the older she got without marrying, the more eyes began to look at her as someone forgotten by time. Education was available but limited. A girl learned only arithmetic to manage expenses and read literary stories only to refine her taste. And if she wrote a diary, she had to hide it, because what she felt was not to be spoken, and what she wished was not to be written. Despite all this, there were women who broke the rules in silence. One read philosophy books at night, another sewed a love letter into the lining of a coat, and another managed her longing with a gentle smile that did not break. Behind the curtains, freedom sometimes passed lightly like a breeze, but it never stayed. And this situation was not only in the homes of the rich, even in middle-class homes, mothers taught their daughters that a woman should not argue, refuse, or dream too much. Life, as they told them, was built on patience and silence. But outside, far from the parlors and assemblies, smoke rose from the factories, and iron had a sound, and the rain tasted of coal. The cities were changing, and the air itself carried the omens of a new era. In the mid-19th century, London was no longer the silent city that tiptoed, it had become a colossal entity that breathed coal, ate time, and forged iron. The Industrial Revolution had cut its way into the heart of life and reshaped the city from mud and fog. The air was no longer clean. Smoke poured from the factory chimneys as if the city were slowly burning. But it was a fire that was not extinguished, it was fed. In every neighborhood, ash drifted from the flats, smells from the sewers, and screams from the machines. London became noisy, not just in sound, but in appearance, smell, and color. The day was no longer white, it became heavy gray, saturated with coal particles. Clothes got dirty quickly, buildings looked faded, and windows were closed more often than opened. Even the rain became black, carrying remnants of smoke and spreading them on the pavements. The city wept in a new color. In the factories, gears turned non-stop. Workers entered with the first light and did not leave until the sun disappeared. No time for rest, no room for complaint. The sound of the machine was louder than everything else. Women worked side by side with men in an environment that knew no mercy, no silence, and not even clean air. The streets buzzed with movement, carts transporting coal, men pushing wooden trolleys loaded with iron, and children running between the alleys carrying messages or selling newspapers. Everything moved, everything produced. Even fatigue seemed regulated as part of the city's new system. And because the revolution was not only industrial but also urban, buildings began to extend upwards. Tall chimneys, iron bridges, and railway tunnels that cut through the heart of the earth appeared. Time acquired a different rhythm, fast, suffocating, and unstoppable. But behind all this progress, there were losses. Trees were cut down to widen streets, gardens shrank, and natural sounds disappeared. The sound of a bird was no longer heard, but the train's whistle. The scent was no longer floral, but of burnt fuel. Despite all this, a new sparkle appeared in people's eyes, a gleam shining through the soot, saying that the world was changing. Some saw salvation from poverty in this change, and others saw the beginning of a long alienation, but no one could stop the wheel. It kept turning, dragging the city with it without looking back. And in the shadow of this progress, the body tired, disease spread, and treatment was attempted without enough knowledge and without effective anesthesia. In the 19th century, London grew rapidly, but medicine did not run with it. It walked slowly, sometimes stumbling in the dark. Medicine in the Victorian era was not a precise science as it is today. Rather, it was like a long journey through doubt, risk, and experimentation. The wound was opened before it was understood, and the disease was diagnosed before its name was known. The patient was sometimes anesthetized only by screaming. In hospitals, there were no clean rooms, no gloves, and no sterilization devices. Tools were used from one patient to another without being washed, and no one knew that unseen germs could be fiercer than the disease itself. Doctors wore black coats and carried leather bags filled with shiny tools that frightened more than they reassured. They revered knowledge, but they did not yet know what was killing people after surgery. They thought that bad air was the cause of bacteria. Surgical operations were performed in front of an audience, like a live show. The patient was tied to the table, and the surgeon began cutting with boldness because time meant agony, and anesthesia was rare. Chloroform did not enter homes until the middle of the century, and before that, the patient had to bite on a piece of cloth, squeeze their eyes shut, or faint from the intensity of the pain. There were sincere attempts to understand. Doctors recorded their notes, tried new herbs, and compared cases. Some began to notice that cleanliness made a difference and that sterilizing tools before surgery reduced the number of deaths, but it was not easy to convince everyone. In the poor districts, there were no real hospitals, but narrow rooms and itinerant doctors carrying small bottles of medicine, prescribing treatments by sight and intuition. Many people relied on herbs and folk remedies, hoping that time or luck would heal them. Among women, midwives filled the void left by formal medicine. They provided care during childbirth, bandaged wounds, and offered herbs for colic and fever. They had no certificates, but they had experience, warm hands, and a reputation passed down through generations. Some diseases were surrounded by fear and shame, such as tuberculosis or madness. The afflicted were isolated, put in asylums from which no one returned. People did not differentiate between mental illness and social stigma, and the patient was sometimes treated as a criminal, not someone needing treatment. But medicine, despite all its cruelty, was learning. In the late century, concepts began to change. Books began talking about germs, microscopes entered laboratories, and there was hope that science would not only heal bodies but also understand them. And in an era where pain was considered a test of patience, shy love letters were written on scented paper, hidden between the folds of books, and sent without a signature. Love was neither light nor simple. It was an emotion suffocated under layers of rules, besieged by formalities, and nurtured like plants in greenhouses, with excessive care and constant caution. A man did not go and suddenly declare his love. He first had to learn the girl's name through an intermediary, then wait for an occasion where he was allowed to meet her under strict supervision. If he wanted to express his admiration, he had to write, not speak. Letters were the language of love, not voice or touch. The letter was written on thick, sometimes scented paper in elegant handwriting, sent with a maid, hidden in a book, or dropped accidentally at a party. Its content had to be free of bold words, but full of innuendo, quotations, and suppressed longing. As for meetings, they took place in public gardens and in front of people. They walked one step apart, talking about the weather and perhaps the last book one of them had read. They were not allowed to sit on the same bench or laugh loudly. Everything was done as if it were a religious rite with its boundaries, gestures, and prohibitions. Even if a girl loved, she could not show it publicly. She had to appear hesitant, modest, and distant, because explicit expression might be misunderstood as ill-breeding or a breach of decorum. And love, in the end, was not granted easily. It was bought with intention, integrity, and status. The man was expected to ask for the girl's hand from her parents, not from her, and to display his income, reputation, and future plans. If the parents agreed, the engagement period began, which was in itself a long series of formal meetings, limited visits, and meticulous supervision. But despite this rigidity, love found its way in long glances at the dinner table, in the flower left on a window. Love was not rare, it was just silent. In the poor classes, things were slightly different, but no easier. Marriage there was often a necessity, not a romance. A young man proposed because the time had come, and a girl agreed because she had no other choice. Emotions were often summed up in a simple phrase, "We will live and get used to it." Yet, in the heart of all those rules, there were lovers who wrote poetry secretly, women who kept letters in sewing boxes, and spouses who whispered to each other at night words no one else heard. But the city, with all its silent love, concealed another face after sunset, a face not governed by rules, not regulated by morality, and not wearing white gloves. When the sun disappeared behind London's chimneys and the last thread of light faded, the city did not sleep. It revealed another face, unwritten about in books and unmentioned in church sermons, but present, silent, and lurking. The night in the Victorian era was not just a break, it was a parallel world that opened its doors when the parlor doors closed. In the dark corners of the back alleys and the lanes not entered by carriages, lost souls sought warmth, a meal, or an exit, even at a price. Brothels spread in poor neighborhoods like stalls. Some were small and windowless, and others were luxurious, resembling hotels. Women there did not use their real names but were known by assumed titles. Some entered this path to escape hunger, and others were forced into it. Choices were few, submission or the street, and often the street was the end. In contrast, crime flourished, petty theft in the markets, small robberies that started with a loaf of bread and ended with jewelry safes. Some neighborhoods, police preferred not to enter except in groups, and some crimes were solved by silence because the scandal was more expensive than justice. As for the swindlers, they were part of the night's fabric, men who disguised themselves as doctors, clergymen, or lawyers and sold people false promises, a magic cure, a job opportunity, or love sold with a bottle of perfume. But the strange thing about all this was that this nightlife, despite its harshness, was sometimes more truthful than the daytime. No one feigned manners here, and no one wore a social mask. At night, wounds were exposed, and hearts expressed themselves clearly, even if they were broken. And these worlds were not far from the palaces, they were on the same streets, in the adjacent neighborhoods, behind the walls. The Victorian night was not just darkness, it was a mirror showing you what you did not see in broad daylight, reminding you that behind every lit parlor lay an untold shadow. But at the heart of this era and at the top of the pyramid, there was a woman watching from afar, who rarely smiled and did not show her emotions, but who ruled an entire empire and defined the features of a whole age. In 1837, Victoria was a girl of 18, little known outside the palace walls. When she was crowned Queen of Great Britain, she did not know that her name would be given to an entire century and that her image would become a symbol of the era and of silence. From the first moment, she seemed different, small, serious, walking with cautious steps and looking at those around her with a gaze that held no hesitation. She rarely smiled or talked unnecessarily. She learned quickly and hid her feelings as precious porcelain is hidden in royal drawers. Victoria ruled for more than 60 years, the longest reign for a queen in British history until then. Under her reign, the empire expanded until it was said that the sun never set on it, from Canada to India, from Africa to Australia. The Queen's pictures hung in schools and offices, her name was raised in the streets, and she was mentioned in formal rituals. But behind the throne was a woman in whom strictness intersected with sorrow. She deeply loved Prince Albert, and when he died after 17 years of marriage, she never recovered. She wore black for the rest of her life and reduced her public appearances, as if her heart had withdrawn from the throne into absence. Since then, she became known as the Mourning Widow. Despite this, she did not relinquish the reins of power. She followed state affairs, wrote long letters to prime ministers, and demanded detailed reports on everything. She was not a puppet on the throne, but a sharp mind that commanded respect without raising her voice. People differed about her. Some saw her as cold, distant, and unfeeling, while others found in her the image of the great mother who silently protected her people and watched from afar without direct interference. She was not close to the people like some monarchs, but she was not absent either. She was there, as mountains are, they do not move, but their shadow is always present. Mourning became a long duty, and black clothing a symbol of sobriety. Women learned seriousness from her, and men feared her firmness. Even political parties considered her stance, although she never openly supported one. She wrote thousands of pages in her diaries, but we do not know exactly what she felt. Her face rarely laughed, and her official portraits held no warmth. Yet, she loved her children, corresponded with her grandchildren, and held the hand of a sick grandchild as a mother holds a child's hand. When she died in January 1901, people mourned not just a woman, but an entire age. The end of an era had begun, and it was as if London, which had breathed coal and lived on traditions, had coughed for the first time and decided to breathe new air. The palaces did not fall, but something in the spirit changed. Black curtains were slowly drawn up, and the streets that had been accustomed to silence began to listen to another rhythm, less strict and more curious. But what that era left behind did not disappear, it seeped into the details, into the way we look at morality, the concept of family, and what is right and proper. Even today, when we stand straight in the presence of strangers or lower our voices in public places, we are reenacting those old shadows without knowing it. The clothes we wear for occasions, the phrases we use in our formal letters, even the designs of some homes and gardens, all bear the mark of that time when the Queen watched without a smile, and society revolved like a clock that knew no chaos. The literature that flourished in the Victorian era still lives among us. The novels of Charles Dickens, the poetry of Tennyson, and the letters of Jane Austen, who preceded the era slightly, are all still read, quoted, and retranslated. And today, when we look at the Queen's stern portraits or read about London's fog-shrouded streets, we do so not only out of curiosity but out of nostalgia, a longing for a time when life was slow, elevated, full of constraints, but also full of secrets. The fog is gone, yes, but its trace remains on the windows, and perhaps every time we close a door gently, arrange our clothes before going out, and whisper instead of shout, we are honoring that time from afar without intending to. Thus, the story ends, but the echo of the Victorian era still resonates.